All right, so today we're going deep into the world of ICH efficacy guidelines.
Specifically, the E series.
You know, these guidelines, they're kind of like the rule book for pharmaceutical companies.
Exactly.
And you're trying to prove their new drugs really do what they're supposed to.
And more importantly, that they're safe for people to use.
Exactly. So it's not just about, does it work? It's about, does it work safely?
Right.
So for this deep dive, we've got a pretty good mix of sources. We've got excerpts from the guidelines themselves.
Straight from the source.
Straight from the source, but I will warn you, they can be a bit dense.
A little bit.
A little bit technical, but we're going to try and break it down, make it understandable. But we also have some really interesting examples from other deep dives we've done.
Yeah, we'll bring in some real-world stuff.
Real-world applications so we can see how these guidelines actually play out in practice.
Exactly, because, what I find fascinating is how much emphasis these guidelines put on endpoints.
Endpoints, yeah.
Those specific outcomes that researchers are looking for in a trial to show that a drug is actually effective.
Right, because it's not enough to just give people a drug and say, well, let's see what happens.
Right.
You have to have a very clear idea of what you're measuring and how you're going to measure it.
Yeah, and the choice of that endpoint, that's crucial.
It is.
I mean, think about it. If you're testing a new medication for something like heart failure,
right,
survival, that might be your primary endpoint.
Okay.
But then you also might look at things like, okay, how many times did they end up back in the hospital? What's their quality of life like?
Right.
Those become your secondary endpoints.
That makes sense. But how do these guidelines actually tell researchers, okay, this is how you pick the right endpoint for your trial?
Well, there's a whole guideline dedicated to that.
Oh, really?
It's E9. And it's pretty interesting. It kind of lays out, how to define endpoints that are going to be clinically relevant.
Okay.
But they also need to be measurable. And, we have to be able to back it up with statistics. So statistically valid.
So you're not just picking endpoints because they're easy to measure.
No. It's got to be driven by the science. What is the scientific question that this trial is trying to answer?
Right.
And then it gets even more complicated because then there's E17, which is all about using multiple endpoints in a single trial.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it can get pretty interesting.
Okay, so multiple endpoints, I can see how that would be useful, especially if a drug is thought to have different effects. You're looking at different things.
Exact.
But doesn't that make the analysis even more complicated?
Oh, it definitely can.
Yeah.
And that's where E17 comes in. It gives you strategies. How are you going to deal with all this data? Make sure you're analyzing it the right way, not drawing misleading conclusions just because you've got all these data points.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but with multiple pieces.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
You've got to have the right tools to put it all together.
Exactly.
And speaking of puzzles, let's talk about something that I think really confuses a lot of people, the whole world of statistical analysis in clinical trials.
Okay, let's unpack that because we all know that statistics are important. But why are they so crucial when we're talking about drug development?
Well, in a trial, what you're doing is you're comparing a group of people who got the drug, right, to a group of people who didn't, your control group.
Okay.
And statistical analysis, that's how we know that the differences we see, are they really because of the drug?
Right.
Or is it just random chance?
So separating the real effects from the noise, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the kind of statistical analysis you do, that really depends on how the trial is designed.
It really is all connected, isn't it?
It's
like you can't talk about endpoints without talking about how you're going to analyze that data. And you can't talk about the analysis without knowing how the trial was designed.
It all goes back to that.
Yeah.
And it's a really carefully orchestrated thing to make sure that the data we're getting is good. It's reliable, and that the conclusions we're drawing, they're scientifically sound.
So can you walk us through, what are some of the different types of statistical analysis, and how does that change, like you were saying, based on the trial design?
Oh, there are so many different statistical methods out there.
Oh, right.
Each one has its strengths and weaknesses. We could talk about t-tests, ANOVAs, and COVAVAs, and then you've got your really complex stuff like Cox regression analysis.
Now, I remember we briefly touched on some of these methods way back when we were talking about generic drugs. And bioequivalence study.
Bioequivalence, right.
So can you remind us, what is that all about?
So for a generic drug to be approved, it has to be shown to be basically the same as the brand name drug.
Okay.
In terms of how your body absorbs it, how it processes it.
So you're comparing those two head to head to see if they behave the same way in the body.
Right.
Okay. And what kind of statistical analysis comes into play there?
Well, in a bioequivalence study, you're often comparing things like how fast the drug is absorbed how much of it gets absorbed.
Right.
And then we use these statistical methods like ANOVA, confidence intervals,
Okay.
to determine if that generic drug, does it fall within a certain range, a pre-specified range of similarity, compared to the brand name.
So it's about proving that the two are pretty much interchangeable from a clinical standpoint.
Yeah, and that takes a lot of statistical rigor.
It does.
To make sure patients can switch back and forth the brand name, the generic, and they're not going to notice a difference
Right.
in how well it works or if it's safe.
This is so fascinating, but before we get too lost in the world of statistics, there's another exciting development I kind of want to touch on, and that is the use of AI in analyzing these clinical trial results.
AI, that's a hot topic.
It is.
It's a hot topic.
Is this something that the guidelines even address yet?
It's an evolving area.
Right.
The current guidelines might not specifically talk about AI,
Okay.
but they do set up a framework for evaluating any new technology, any new method that we're using in drug development.
So even though AI is relatively new to the game, those same principles of, doing good science, making sure your data is accurate.
The rigor.
Yeah, that rigor, they still apply.
Absolutely.
And that's good to know.
Yeah, and what's great about these guidelines is that they can adapt.
Okay.
So as new technologies come up, we can work them into that existing framework
Right.
to make sure that we're always using the best possible tools to evaluate, is this drug safe? Is it effective?
That is reassuring.
Yeah.
I mean, AI has the potential to really revolutionize so many aspects of healthcare.
I know. It's pretty amazing.
So it's really exciting to see how it's starting to play a role in drug development.
Yeah, think about it. Imagine using AI to go through, mountains of data from a trial.
Right.
Pick out these subtle patterns, trends that a human might miss.
That could really speed things up.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And potentially lead to some breakthroughs.
Yeah, absolutely.
It could help us design better trials, find the patients who are actually going to benefit the most.
Right.
Maybe even predict side effects. It's pretty amazing.
The possibilities are really endless.
They are.
But we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves.
No, we still have a lot to cover with the current guidelines.
We do. So where do we go from here?
Well, we've talked about endpoints, we've talked about statistical analysis, but there's this one really challenging aspect of drug development we haven't really dived into yet.
Okay, what's that?
It's extrapolating data from adult trials to children.
Oh, yeah, pediatric trials.
A whole other ball game.
It is, yeah.
It's a whole other ball game, and it's something that these ICH guidelines, they address it very, very carefully.
Well, I'm ready to dive into that.
Let's do it. So we've talked a lot about, getting solid data from clinical trials.
Oh, right.
But what happens when we're trying to develop medications for kids?
Yeah.
It's not as simple as just giving them a smaller dose of what we give adults.
Definitely not.
No.
Kids aren't just tiny adults. Their bodies work differently.
Exactly.
They metabolize drugs differently.
Yeah.
And ethically, there are so many more things to think about.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there, and that's where ICH E11 comes in.
Okay.
This guideline is all about setting those specific standards for clinical trials
Okay.
when you're working with children.
Got it.
And believe me, it gets complicated fast.
I bet it does. And I know we touched on this earlier, that whole idea of extrapolating data.
Yeah.
So using what we know from adult trials
Right.
to kind of predict how a drug might act in kids.
Right.
But how reliable is that really?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
And E11, it really tackles this head on.
Okay.
When is it okay to extrapolate, and when do we absolutely need to do a trial just for kids?
Right.
It's all about balancing what we already know with the need to create new data.
Right.
To make sure those kids are getting the right treatments.
Yeah, so it's tricky, right?
Oh, it is.
Because on the one hand, we don't want to put kids at risk in clinical trials unnecessarily, but at the same time, they deserve medications that have been properly tested for them.
Exactly. And that's why E11 is really strong on the ethical side of things.
Okay.
Informed consent from the parents, that's absolutely critical.
Right.
And the potential benefits, you have to weigh those very carefully against any risks.
That makes sense. It's a balancing act for sure.
It is.
But what about the practical side of things?
Yeah.
I mean, are there specific challenges to doing research on drugs in children that make those trials even more difficult?
Oh, absolutely. For one thing, just finding kids to participate.
Recruitment. Right.
Recruitment. Yeah, pediatric diseases, they can be pretty rare.
Right.
So finding enough kids who meet your criteria, that's a challenge.
Right. And even when you find them, you have to make sure the parents understand what's involved.
Oh, yeah. Informed consent, that's a big one.
Yeah.
And then you've got different dosage forms for different ages.
Right. because you can't give a 2-year-old the same pill as a 10-year-old.
It's a logistical nightmare sometimes.
I can imagine. And then there's that whole issue of how kids process drugs differently than adults.
Right.
How do researchers account for that when they're looking at the data?
Well, that's where the statistical analysis gets even more complex.
Okay.
E11 is really clear that you need to use methods that take into account age, weight, developmental stage, all of that.
So it's not just a one-size-fits-all kind of analysis.
No, it's very tailored.
Got it.
And then you've got to interpret those results, right? And figure out how they apply to bigger populations.
Right. So how much can you really extrapolate from a small group of kids to all kids with that condition?
Right. And E11 gives you a framework for doing that.
Okay.
But it's cautious. It recognizes that extrapolation has limits. Sometimes you just need to do a trial in kids.
Right. You can't get around it.
No, you can't.
So it sounds like E11 is really kind of like this multi-layered safety net,
I like that.
making sure every decision in a pediatric trial is really putting the child first
Exactly.
and following the best science.
That's the goal.
Okay, so we've talked about the ethical considerations,
Yeah.
the practical challenges.
Uh-huh.
What about the regulatory side of things?
Yeah.
How do these guidelines influence the actual drug approval process when we're talking about medications specifically for kids?
Remember, the whole point of the ICH is to get everyone on the same page.
Right, global harmonization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if a company wants to market their drug worldwide,
Right.
they have to follow these guidelines, including the ones on pediatric trials.
Okay, but what if a company feels like their drug is just not appropriate for kids?
Right.
Do they still have to jump through all those hoops of E11?
Not necessarily. There are cases where you can get a waiver
Okay.
or defer the pediatric studies if the drug is clearly not intended for children.
Okay.
Maybe it's a condition that only adults get,
Right.
or there's already evidence that the drug is unsafe for kids.
Right. So it's not just about doing the trials for the sake of doing them.
Exactly. They have to be justified,
Right.
both ethically and scientifically.
It's all about protecting kids
Yeah.
while also making sure they have access to the medications they need.
Right.
It's a delicate balance.
It is.
But I think these guidelines really help us find that balance.
I think so, too.
This has been so insightful.
It's a fascinating area.
It really is. It shows how these guidelines are constantly adapting
They have to.
to keep up with all the changes in healthcare
Right.
and drug development.
In recent years, there's been a big push towards this idea of patient centricity.
Patient centricity. Yeah. So it's recognizing that patients aren't just subjects in a study.
Right.
They're real people
They're people.
with lives and opinions.
And experiences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how are these guidelines reflecting that shift?
Well, there's been a move towards developing new guidelines,
Okay.
specifically on engaging patients in the drug development process.
Okay, so it's not just asking patients what they think at the end.
No.
It's involving them right from the start.
From the beginning, like E8R1, that gives specific recommendations on how to do that.
So that would involve everything from how you design the consent forms.
Yeah, making them easy to understand
Right.
to how you communicate the trial results.
Right, making it meaningful for patients.
Exactly.
And so it sounds like the guidelines are becoming more responsive to the needs and priorities of the people who will actually benefit from these treatments.
Yeah, and it really highlights the collaborative nature of this whole thing.
That's a good point.
It's not just scientists in a lab.
Right.
It's scientists, regulators, healthcare professionals,
Patients.
and most importantly, the patients, all working together.
Yeah, it's a team effort
It is.
to move medicine forward.
Absolutely.
It's inspiring to see how everyone's coming together to shape the future of healthcare.
It is.
And the guidelines are a big part of that.
Yeah, they foster that collaboration.
Right.
And they make sure that new drugs are developed to the highest standards.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture of the guidelines. But I'm curious about the nitty-gritty.
The details.
The details. Yeah, what kind of specific information do they actually provide to researchers and companies?
Well, it depends on the guideline.
Oh, right.
Some are focused on specific types of studies, like E9. That's all about statistical principles for clinical trials. While others, like E6, that's good clinical practice. It's a very practical guide.
Got it.
So it's like a toolbox, different tools for different jobs.
Right. And each tool is designed to make sure the job gets done right.
Exactly. And each guideline gives you clear recommendations.
Okay.
Best practices, how to conduct your research, collect your data, keep patients safe, all of that.
Can you give us a specific example?
Sure, let's take E6, good clinical practice, right?
Yeah.
Good day.
Okay.
It tells you everything from how to get informed consent from your participants
Okay.
to making sure that data stays confidential,
Right.
to how you monitor for and report any bad side effects.
So it's like a step-by-step manual
It is.
for doing ethical research.
Yeah, and rigorous research.
Okay, so I can see how this could feel overwhelming.
Oh, I'm sure.
For someone who's new to all this, the guidelines are so detailed and comprehensive.
They are.
How do researchers and companies even keep up with it all?
Well, the ICH, they do a great job of providing resources.
Okay.
On their website, there's training materials, webinars, question and answer documents, all of that.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, and they're always updating it
Okay.
to reflect any changes or clarifications to the guidelines.
So there's support out there
There is.
for people trying to navigate all this.
There is.
That's good to know. And it's crucial to stay updated
It is.
because, as we've seen, these guidelines are always evolving.
Always.
They're living documents.
Yeah, they have to keep up with the science.
And that's a lot of work, but it's worth it
Oh, absolutely.
to make sure the medications we're taking are safe and effective.
That's the goal.
Okay, so we've talked about the technical aspects of the guidelines.
Right.
But I'm curious about the real-world impact.
On patients.
Right.
I mean, most patients probably don't even know these guidelines exist.
Probably not.
But how do they actually affect their lives?
That's a great question.
Yeah,
And it's one that I think gets overlooked a lot.
I think so.
But the truth is, these guidelines have a huge impact on the lives of patients around the world.
How so?
Well, think about it. They're the foundation
Okay.
for making sure that the medications we're taking are safe,
Right.
that they're effective, they make sure that drugs work the way they're supposed to,
Right.
they address drug quality,
But-
manufacturing consistency,
Okay.
even down to the way we monitor and report side effects.
So it's about building a safer and more reliable healthcare system for everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're also speeding up the development of new treatments.
Okay, how so?
Well, by having these harmonized regulatory requirements
Okay.
across different countries,
Right.
that makes it easier to do clinical trials
Right.
and get those new drugs to market faster.
So patients everywhere can benefit.
Exactly. And it's not just about speed. It's
Mhm.
about making sure those trials are done ethically
Right.
with the highest scientific standards.
Okay, that's good.
And the guidelines also really emphasize the importance of patient rights,
Right.
incorporating their perspectives into the research.
So it's about making sure new treatments actually meet the needs of the patients.
Absolutely. It's amazing to see how these guidelines are impacting global healthcare,
It is.
making a difference in people's lives every day.
And it reminds us that even with all the technical stuff,
Yeah,
the regulations, it's really about people.
it is.
It's about improving their health, helping them live longer, better lives.
Beautifully said.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
Pediatric trials, patient centricity, the global impact of these guidelines.
It's a lot.
But I have a feeling we've only scratched the surface.
Oh, we have. There's so much more we could explore. Safety pharmacology, bioequivalence testing, real-world evidence.
It's a whole world unto itself.
Yes.
But I think this is a good place to pause for now.
I agree, but before we wrap up, I do want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay, I'm all ears.
We've seen how complex these ICH efficacy guidelines are,
Mm-hmm.
but at the end of the day, it's all about one thing:
What's that?
protecting patients, making sure they have access to safe and effective treatments.
That's a powerful message.
It is, and it's something we should all keep in mind
Yeah.
as we continue to explore this fascinating world of drug development
Absolutely.
and work to improve global health.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration.
Until then, stay curious, keep learning.
Wow, we've really been digging deep into these ICH efficacy guidelines, haven't we?
We have, from those pediatric trials, all the ethical considerations.
Right, and how important it is to involve patients.
Absolutely. Patient perspectives are crucial.
Yeah, and of course all those statistics, making sure that the data from the trials is solid.
It's all connected, and we can't forget that global perspective.
Right, the ICH, it's bringing everyone together, harmonizing drug development all over the world.
It's a big deal.
It is, but sometimes I wonder, with all this focus on rules and processes,
Yeah.
how does this actually translate into real-world impact for patients?
That's a great question. And, most people probably have no idea these guidelines even exist,
Probably not.
but they're working behind the scenes, making sure the medications people are taking are safe, effective, made to the highest standards.
It's like they're the unsung heroes of healthcare, you know?
I like that, the unsung heroes, because it's true.
It's kind of a paradox, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, these guidelines are so detailed and complex,
They are.
but their impact is often invisible to the very people they're designed to protect.
It is, but think about it this way. When you take a medication,
Okay.
you just trust that it's going to work, that it's not going to hurt you.
All right, you assume it's safe.
Right, and that trust, that's built on a foundation of good science.
Rigorous research?
Exactly, careful oversight, and that's what these guidelines provide.
So it's not just about red tape and bureaucracy.
No.
It's really about building that trust,
Absolutely.
confidence in the medicines we depend on.
It is, and they're not static either, these guidelines.
Right. They're always evolving.
Always. One area that I find really exciting is the use of biomarkers in clinical trials.
Biomarkers. I've heard that term, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Oh, it's pretty simple. Basically, a biomarker is anything that can be measured
Okay.
that tells you about a biological process or a change in someone's health.
Okay, so for example.
So let's say we're studying a new drug for Alzheimer's.
Okay.
A biomarker might be the level of a specific protein in the cerebrospinal fluid that's linked to the disease progression.
So by measuring that protein level,
You can see if the drug is actually slowing down the disease.
it's like a window into what's happening in the brain.
Exactly. And biomarkers, they're not just for tracking disease.
Oh, really?
No, you can use them to figure out who might benefit from a certain treatment,
Okay.
to predict how someone's going to respond to a drug,
Okay.
even to watch for side effects.
Wow. So biomarkers could revolutionize how we develop and test new drugs.
I think so. In the ICH, they've recognized that.
They have.
Oh, yeah. There are several guidelines now that specifically address biomarkers.
Like that.
Well, E16, that one outlines how to qualify a biomarker, make sure it's reliable.
So it's not just measuring something, it's making sure the measurement actually means something.
Exactly. And then there's E20 that focuses on using biomarkers for safety assessment.
Okay.
And E18, that one's all about genomic biomarkers, the ones in our DNA.
So this is really personalized medicine.
It is tailoring treatment to each individual patient.
It's amazing to think about what we might be able to do in the future.
It is, as we learn more about the human genome, the connection between our genes, our environment, and disease.
The possibilities seem endless.
I think so. But even with all this excitement about new technology,
Right.
we can't forget about patient safety.
Absolutely. That's paramount.
Always. And that brings us back to one of the guidelines we talked about before, ICH E14.
The one about QTC prolongation.
That's the one. Remember, that's a heart rhythm problem that some drugs can cause.
Right. It can be really dangerous.
It can, and E14 lays out a plan for assessing and managing that risk.
Okay. How does that work?
Well, there's this thing called a thorough QTQTC study.
Okay.
It involves monitoring the patient's heart rhythm with an ECG.
So you're basically screening the drug
Yeah, to make sure it's not going to cause any heart problems.
before it goes any further in development.
Exactly. And if that study shows any red flags,
Then what?
then they need to do more testing.
Right.
Maybe additional studies or special monitoring during the trials.
Got it. So it's all about protecting patients.
It is.
It's amazing how these guidelines keep evolving
They do.
to keep up with the latest science.
That's what makes them so valuable. They're not just static documents.
They're living guidelines,
That's a great way to put it.
reflecting our growing understanding of medicine and drug development.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a fascinating exploration.
It has.
And what really strikes me is that these ICH efficacy guidelines, they're not just about rules and regulations.
No, they're not.
They're really about making sure new drugs are developed the right way,
The right way.
with good science, ethically,
Yeah,
and with the goal of improving people's lives,
that's it. It's a global effort to harmonize drug development.
and ultimately to benefit patients all over the world.
Absolutely.
It's really an important mission.
It is.
Well, I think this brings us to the end of our deep dive for today.
I agree. We could probably talk about this for hours.
Easy them.
But I have a feeling we'll be revisiting these guidelines again in the future.
Oh, definitely, as we continue to explore the world of drug development and healthcare.
Absolutely.
So until then, thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've learned something new and maybe gained a new appreciation for the incredible work that goes into developing the medications we rely on.
And as always, stay curious.
And keep those brains engaged.